Hello, welcome to today's webinar, the 2020 election season and the Great Lakes. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President of Communications and Engagement, and I'll be monitoring today's conversation. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We are excited to have over 200 people registered for today's webinar. To limit background noise, all participant lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. To ask a question, use the question box as shown here at any time during the webinar. We'll leave plenty of time for your questions after the presentation, and we'll try to get as many of them as we can. Also, later this afternoon, everyone on this call will receive an email with links to a recording of the webinar and several resources that we'll share during the presentation. I'm excited about today's conversation. Our speakers today will include Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO, Joel Bremeyer, the Alliance's Chief Operating Officer, Molly Flanagan, both of them joining us from Chicago, and the Alliance's Vice President for Policy and Strategic Engagement, Crystal M.C. Davis, who is joining us from Cleveland, Ohio. With that, I'll turn it over to Joel Bremeyer. Joel?
Thank you, Jen. First of all, thanks to each of you on the webinar who are joining us today. Your support and your voice makes the work of the Alliance for the Great Lakes possible, and I really appreciate you being here, especially because today is only 34 days away from Election Day. You and millions of voters like you across the Great Lakes are getting ready to mark your ballots. From the issues voters and candidates are discussing to how candidates are campaigning for office, the 2020 election season has dramatically changed since March. The COVID-19 pandemic and related economic crisis have upended our daily lives. They've reshaped electoral campaign activity and several high-profile racial incidents, from the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery to the viral video of racist threats against Christian Cooper, a Black birder in Central Park, have thrust social and racial justice to the forefront of the national conversation. And in the midst of all of this, clean water is more important than ever. Hand washing is one of the top public health recommendations for reducing the spread of COVID, and we know that not everyone here can access safe and clean Great Lakes water. This gap between basic health advice and the on-the-ground reality is a reminder of the critical importance of clean water to our personal health and to the health and safety of our families and our communities. The Great Lakes define the 8 states that they touch, providing drinking water to roughly 30 million Americans and driving our region's economy. And because of this, support for their protection transcends political and geographic divisions like few other issues, environmental or otherwise. A recent Harvard poll found that the right to clean air and water was considered important by 93% of those surveyed, including supermajorities across political lines. A Great Lakes regional poll conducted by the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition found that 91% of those surveyed support federal efforts to protect the Great Lakes and improve drinking water. These numbers hold true across political, geographic, and demographic groups. So while the presidential election is driving much of the election year conversation, candidates are running for office at the local, state, and federal levels. Every office on the ballot, from mayors to the president, has an opportunity to influence Great Lakes and water issues once in office. For instance, the president and the state governors select agency staff who are legally mandated to enforce environmental protections. Governors have primary oversight over the Great Lakes water supply. They and their appointees make critical decisions over who gets to use Great Lakes water. Congress appropriates funds every year. Congress has appropriated more than $3 billion for Great Lakes restoration over the last 10 years, with support from a bipartisan coalition. State legislatures set budgets for state agencies, and they allocate funding for water infrastructure, the pipes that provide drinking water and keep sewage out of the lakes. And mayors and city councils make choices about how to invest in that infrastructure, and also can set and enforce local environmental and zoning regulations. Tonight, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden will step onto the debate stage. This first debate is set squarely in the Great Lakes region, just off the shore of Lake Erie in Cleveland, Ohio, at Case Western Reserve University. In recent days, 2 Lake Erie news outlets, the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Buffalo News, have argued for the inclusion of Great Lakes issues in the debates. I hope the moderator or the candidates themselves raise these topics. We know the Great Lakes are not just an environmental issue. They're at the center of debates about public health, sustainable economic development, and federal funding priorities. The Great Lakes have long enjoyed strong bipartisan support because people of all backgrounds see the value of clean water. To protect the lakes, we need to do three things. We have to defend existing clean water laws while pushing for stronger, better protections for the world's largest source of fresh water. We have to make the case for even greater investment in the Great Lakes, especially in places where we know clean water needs are not being met. And we have to ensure that everyone in the Great Lakes region can use and enjoy the lakes and share access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. Right now, we have an opportunity to encourage candidates to stand up for Great Lakes and hold them accountable once elected. Your voice and your vote matter. Voters like you can make sure that the Great Lakes and clean water are part of the election year conversation. Now, before we move on to the specifics of our voter toolkit, I want to just talk a little bit about our role in an election year. We get a lot of questions about the Alliance's involvement in these big election years. So I want to clarify that role and some of the boundaries we have because of our status as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Alliance for the Great Lakes cannot support or oppose candidates or political parties. However, we can and we do educate candidates and voters on Great Lakes issues. For instance, with today's webinar, we can share information about important Great Lakes issues and help people get involved in the democratic process. So with that disclaimer, I'll hand the conversation off to Molly Flanagan, the Alliance's Chief Operating Officer, to share our toolkit.
Thanks, Joel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to share our new voter toolkit with you. I'm going to go through the nuts and bolts of this. We hope it helps you get involved this election season. I'm going to cover the top 5 Great Lakes questions to ask candidates for elected office. Then I'm going to turn it over to Crystal, who's going to talk about how to personalize the toolkit. Then you'll hear from me again about the top 5 ways to get involved this election season. And finally, I'll wrap up with some information about background on Great Lakes issues and deep dive questions that you can ask candidates. In 2020, many federal, state, and local offices are on the ballot around the Great Lakes region. At the top of the ticket are the presidential candidates. Indiana is the only one of the Great Lakes states with the gubernatorial election this season. Michigan, Minnesota, and Illinois have U.S. Senate seats on the ballot, and all seats in the U.S. House of Representatives are up for election. At the state level, a number of state legislators are up for election, and at the local level, some offices like mayors and city council seats are on the ballot. Asking candidates for office where they stand on Great Lakes issues raises awareness about these issues, and it allows us as constituents to hold them accountable once they take office. To get you started, I'm going to go through the 5 questions about the Great Lakes that you can ask candidates. Question number 1, what is your number 1 Great Lakes policy priority? This is an opportunity for you to understand how a candidate aligns with issues that are important to you and your community. You might hear answers on anything from safe drinking water to stopping the spread of invasive species or mitigating the impacts of climate change and high lake levels. Question number 2, what policies will you put in place to ensure Great Lakes communities have safe, clean, and affordable drinking water? Although we live on the shores of the world's largest freshwater system, many people around the region don't have access to safe, clean water, and many struggle to afford their water bills. This question gives you a chance to ask candidates what they will do if elected to ensure that everyone has access to water. Question number 3, if elected, what would you do in your first 100 days in office to protect the Great Lakes for people who live, work, and play in the region and depend on them for drinking water? This question is another opportunity to hone in on a candidate's priorities. The first 100 days in office is a critical time for elected officials to set their priorities for their term in office. And most of them release ideas about what they're going to do during that critical time frame. You want issues that you care about to be issues the candidates care enough about to address during this important time frame. Question number 4, what will you do to increase much needed funding for the Great Lakes region's failing drinking and wastewater infrastructure and ensure that no one loses access to water and sewer services because of an inability to pay? When our water infrastructure fails, it means that pollution ends up in people's homes, businesses, and in the lakes, and drinking water can be contaminated. The Great Lakes region has some of the oldest water infrastructure in the entire country. Repairing this failing infrastructure is going to cost our region billions of dollars. And it only gets more expensive the longer we wait to make these critical investments. It's important to learn how candidates for office will pay for these important projects, and at the same time, protect people who are unable to pay more. And finally, question number 5. How will you ensure that businesses, from industrial facilities to industrial agriculture, are held accountable for pollution flowing into our waterways? Elected officials from the federal government to city agencies have the power to create new regulations or enforce existing ones to keep pollution out of our rivers and lakes. And now I'm going to turn things over to Crystal to explain how you can customize the toolkit. Take it away, Crystal.
Thanks, Molly, and good afternoon. I am so excited about the functionality of this toolkit as we prepare for another important election. And I'm not just saying that because that's part of the script. As someone who has spent my entire life in government relations, I'm really excited about this project. We have intentionally designed this toolkit to allow for customization based on geography and water priorities. So feel free to incorporate your own stories when asking questions of candidates for elected office. You can modify our questions by replacing Great Lakes with your home lake. Adding your own personal experiences can be powerful and can help to get attention for the issues that you care about. It's also important to note that you can tailor the questions to fit the candidate with whom you are speaking. It helps to connect the dots between the issues you care about, the agencies that are responsible, and the public office holder who has the most influence over that agency and issue. Some quick detective work, not long research, just quick detective work using your searching the web pages of your local city or village, as well as drinking water, stormwater, and sewage treatment service providers, will describe which office holders are responsible for those agencies, their budgets, which is really important, and policies that impact your daily life. After you have identified the local issues you care about and the candidates who are seeking offices that influence those issues, engage them on those issues. For instance, if you are concerned about rising water and sewer bills, your local water and sewer districts set the rates, but your mayor or city council could have influence over some of those decisions. Other examples of ways to customize the questions are, what is your #1 Lake Erie policy priority? Or you could say something like, I live in Ohio, where there are an estimated 650,000 lead service lines. I've learned that over the next 20 years, we're facing a price tag of about $27 billion to address aging drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. I'm concerned about people in our community who are on fixed incomes, and especially the elderly, who are already struggling to pay their water bills. What policies will you put in place to ensure Ohioans have safe, clean, and affordable drinking water? And to help you get involved this year, we have launched the nonpartisan Great Lakes Voter Information Center. And you can use this tool to check your voter registration status. And I'll say that is very important. Don't make the assumption that you are still registered if you haven't voted in recent elections. So please check your voter registration status. You can also learn about candidates on your local ballot. You can find your polling location. Again, your polling location may have changed. So it's a great idea to verify the location as you start to make your voting plans. And you can also learn about the mail-in or absentee voting process for your state. The Great Lakes Voter Information Center is also bilingual and available in English and Spanish. And it is super easy to use. Just type in the address where you are registered to vote, and it will check your registration status. If you're not registered, you will be connected with information you need to register to vote. But check soon, because many voter registration deadlines are coming up in the next few weeks. Just hours ago, I was testing the tool and I verified my own registration and was able to look up information about the candidates and current office holders representing my area. Feel free to share this valuable tool with your friends, your family, your neighbors, coworkers, everybody within your networks as they begin to make those voting plans. Again, it's nonpartisan and a great resource for anyone looking forward to exercising their civic duty this election cycle. Molly?
Ooh, and I remembered to unmute both times. Thanks, Crystal. By now, you may be wondering how you can get involved. Or perhaps you already have gotten involved, and if so, congratulations and thank you. Whether it's asking questions at a candidate forum, chiming in on social media, or highlighting water issues in a letter to the editor, your voice really does make a difference. People running for office pay attention to issues that bubble to the top in all of these venues. So I'm going to talk a bit about the top 5 ways that you can get involved. And the number 1 way is to vote. If you only do one thing this election season, please vote. Voting is the most important way for you to have a voice in how our elected officials protect our water. Unfortunately, voting today is not as simple as just showing up to mark your ballot on election day. As Crystal referenced, some states have purged voter rolls. Some states have enacted new identity verification rules. This impacts many people's ability to vote. And COVID-19 health concerns may impact election day. It could result in fewer polling places in some places, or it could mean that your polling place is moved. That's why it's critical to make a voting plan to be sure your voice is heard on election day. As Crystal said, you can use our Great Lakes Voter Information Center to help you make your plan. Number 2, learn about the elected officials on the ballot. Elected officials set priorities that can lead to better protections for the lakes, or alternatively, leave them more vulnerable to pollution. They oversee agencies that implement clean water laws, and they make critical budget decisions that impact Great Lakes programs. While federal officials have significant influence on the health of the Great Lakes, your local mayor, city council members, and state house representatives can have enormous impact on local environmental issues. They oversee agencies that implement clean water laws, like the ones set by your local environmental departments. And agencies make critical budget decisions that impact your drinking water quality and your water bills. Our Voter Information Center can help you learn about the offices on your ballot this year. Number 3, attend a virtual candidate forum. Candidate forums are an important way for you to get your issue on the agenda by asking questions about how the candidate plans to take action if elected. This year, most candidate forums have been moved online. The formats can vary, but they often allow for participants from the audience to ask questions of the candidate. Some events ask for these questions to be submitted ahead of time, and some of them allow you to ask questions right there on the spot. It helps to know the format ahead of time if you're interested in asking a question, like some of the questions that we covered at the beginning, and some deep dive questions that I'll cover at the end. Number 4, speak out on social media. Voters like you can make sure that the Great Lakes and clean water are part of the election year conversation. A great place to start is speaking out on social media. Many campaigns keep an eye on social media for topics that people are talking about. News outlets that are asking candidates questions also pay attention to social media to know what is top of mind for voters. And number 5, get out the vote. So if you followed along, maybe participated in some events, asked some questions, and stayed informed on important issues, now what? It's time to get out and vote. Once you've made sure that you're registered and ready to vote, it's just as important to make sure your friends, family, and members of your community are registered and ready too. You can share our Great Lakes Voter Information Center with everyone you know to help them make their voting plan. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about what you can do if you have the opportunity to go a little bit deeper on some of the issues around the Great Lakes and water quality. If you have the opportunity to have a deeper conversation with a candidate running for elected office, we've included additional questions in the voter toolkit that can help you dig into an issue to learn more about their election platform. Some questions are tailored for federal candidates, while others are for candidates for state level office. But many of the questions in the toolkit can be tailored to work for any candidate running for election. The toolkit includes information on a number of issues. Clean and affordable drinking water. You'll find background information and specific questions that you can ask about drinking water infrastructure and investment, sewage and stormwater runoff infrastructure and investment, drinking water and sewer service affordability, drinking water quality issues like lead in drinking water, and agricultural pollution. The toolkit also covers background information and specific questions related to environmental protection and restoring the Great Lakes. It covers the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, some issues related to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and issues related to aquatic invasive species, both keeping them out of the Great Lakes and preventing them from moving around the lakes. I hope you have an opportunity to dig deep on an issue that you care about with candidates this year. And remember, if you only do one thing this election season, please vote. Jen, I'm turning it back to you for questions.
Okay. Thanks, Molly. Let's see. Okay, trying to get us set up. Hopefully everybody can see our panelists. And also still see the sign for how to share a question. I see some have popped in already, but we'd love to hear your questions. Just use the question box on the side or the chat box if you can't figure out the question box. There's multiple ways there. We will dig right in. I do want to, before we get into questions, I do just want to let people know, I know that Joel, Molly, and Crystal shared a number of resources, and we will be sending everyone an email this afternoon, probably an hour or two after the webinar, with a link to this recording, links to the full toolkit, links to the Voter Information Center, and all this great info, so you can use it, share it, and all that. So please keep an eye out for all those tools coming into your mailbox a little bit later today. I do also just want to remind everyone about our role as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which Joel mentioned earlier. We can talk about the issues, we can talk about everything as a whole we can talk about, but we can't talk about or specifically endorse certain specific candidates, so we can't endorse candidates. So, but send your questions in and we'll filter through them. So I think one of the first questions I have here, which I think is a great one, it's kind of more of a comment, but maybe this is for you, Crystal. Someone shares that their comment says, don't be afraid to call local and regional candidates to ask about their policies. I did. So thank you, Robin, for doing that. But I think, Crystal, that's another way maybe that people can learn a little bit more about, you know, issues or perspectives from their elected officials. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. I say those are folks who are elected by you to represent you. So you should have an understanding of what their stance is on all of the issues that you care about. And I would also implore you to get to know their legislative staff as well. As a former State House staffer, I know the power that they hold in terms of getting access to that elected official as well. So get to know your state representatives and your local elected officials and their staff as well.
Thanks, Crystal. You know, I see a couple of questions here, which this isn't exactly a Great Lakes issue, but might be more about how to find out some information. And I guess this is a question I'll direct to maybe Joel or Molly. In Illinois here, there's a big tax issue on the state ballot. It's called the fair tax. Certainly the Alliance isn't involved in those, and we can't have a position on that. But I think there's a good question there about all of the other issues that are on ballots and how one might learn about whether or not that impacts the Great Lakes or not. I know our Voter Info Center can't do that, but I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on how to help people wade through all those issues and whether or not they might impact the Great Lakes. Any thoughts on that, Joel or Molly?
I'll take a quick stab at it, and especially now that I'm looking at the right camera, which is fantastic for everybody. One thing to pay attention to is learn about how your state uses its general revenue or its general fund. And so general funds are funds that are generated by basic taxes that we all pay. And sometimes or often those funds are directed to support the work of agencies that you might care a lot about, like the Department of Natural Resources or your state environmental protection agency, whatever it's called. And so investigating how your state uses those general funds to support the budgets of agencies is one way that you can gauge or help inform your thoughts about how the state uses its tax revenue and how that might be directed in the future. And Molly and Crystal, feel free to jump in.
I will say specifically to Illinois that if you live in the state of Illinois, you should have gotten a mailer that looks like this, if I can get that to the camera, about the constitutional amendment from the Secretary of State that has some information about what it is in the actual language. But in terms of, making decisions about whether voting on a ballot issue is the right decision for you, you can do searches of those issues and look to organizations that you trust, that have information about that, to help you learn more about the issue and learn more about potential impacts. So I would definitely encourage you to go online and see what organizations you trust are saying about the issue.
Thank you. Keep the questions coming. We've got lots of great questions. I also see a number of comments about our role as a 501c3 nonprofit and the fact that we can't endorse. That is out of our hands. That's something set by the IRS. So, that's we have to stay within those rules to retain our charitable status as we have now. I'm seeing some good questions here. One person is asking for a little bit more information on an issue. She says that she's concerned about water exports from the Great Lakes. So, there's always been this longstanding concern that states that are very dry, like the West and Southwest, and certainly they're suffering from serious drought, that they might somehow be able to tap into Great Lakes water. And so the question asker is asking for any insights on the issue, the status of the issue, because she's planning on asking elected officials and candidates about that to get their position. So she'd just like a little more background on that so she can ask some good questions. Thanks, Deborah. That's a great question. Joel and Molly, would you like to take that one?
I'll start, sure. So the Great Lakes water supply is pretty well protected from being exported to far-flung places. So it'd be legally very difficult, if not impossible, to export water either across the country or to a different country outside of the U.S. Thanks to a policy that's in place called the Great Lakes Compact. And you can read more about that on our website. There are a couple of very small exceptions to that, where communities close by the Great Lakes can access Great Lakes water if they meet some very strict conditions. But that policy is something we feel provides really strong protections for the Great Lakes water supply. It's important that anybody elected to office is committed to keeping those protections in place. And that's something that we would educate every candidate on. And I also would just recognize that we have done a really good job of kind of protecting our water supply to keep it here in the Great Lakes region. We haven't done as good of a job of keeping it clean and safe for everybody to use. And so that's where a lot of focus is now, is in cleaning up some of the contamination problems that are actually compromising our drinking water supply.
Thanks, Joel. I also see several questions and variations on a question. We've got a lot of questions, so I'm sort of smushing them together here a little bit. Asking if the Alliance puts out a questionnaire. You see that from some groups. Do we put out questionnaires to candidates? And if we do or don't, where to get that kind of information? Again, to get some more specifics about what candidates are saying about Great Lakes issues. We don't send out questionnaires, but I'll let, maybe I'll toss that one to you, Molly, to tackle that question.
Yeah, we don't do candidate questionnaires, but a number of environmental organizations and other nonprofit civic organizations do candidate questionnaires. If you're looking for information specifically around environmental or Great Lakes issues, the Sierra Club often does candidate questionnaires. Also, your local environmental council often does candidate questionnaires. So in Illinois, that's the Illinois Environmental Council. In Ohio, the Ohio Environmental Council. And so those are some places that you could look to. You can probably Google also, environmental candidate questionnaires, and you'll get sent to some of those places or like specific to your state to find them. But there certainly are a number of organizations that do those questionnaires and ask really thoughtful questions, and sometimes get responses from all the candidates, sometimes get responses only from a couple of candidates. And so it's a good resource to refer to.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. And Crystal, I don't know if you would want to chime in on, just sort of the overall importance of just candidate education about issues, especially for groups like the Alliance. We can talk equally to all of the candidates for any office as long as we're sort of equal in that outreach. You want to talk a little more about that, Crystal?
Sure. I'd like to say that just because a candidate or an elected office holder has not spoken out about an issue that you care about doesn't mean that they don't care about that issue. And so it's really important to sit down with them, gauge their interest in these issues, and then when prompted, definitely give some education on these issues. I've met time and time again with local elected officials and state elected officials who want to know more about Great Lakes issues. And so spending that quality time kind of getting them up to speed on the pulse of the community in relation to Great Lakes issues is time well spent and is valuable altogether.
Thanks, Crystal. I see one commenter asking if the Alliance can't endorse, can we say who shouldn't be endorsed? No, that's the same thing. But I appreciate the effort there. So I guess another couple questions, certainly climate change is an issue that's kind of top of mind for a lot of people this year. Water levels here in the Great Lakes are related to climate change. And certainly we're seeing the terrible news about all of the wildfires from the states out west. And so, I have a couple questions here asking just about the issue of climate change in the Great Lakes, and what are some specific things that we might want to ask candidates about climate change. Joel, maybe I'll toss that one to you. Do you have any thoughts on that for these question askers?
Sure. The problem of global climate change, of course, is one that is having effects everywhere, and it's certainly already having impacts on the Great Lakes. Jen mentioned lake levels, more extreme storms, precipitation that is more extreme and less predictable than it was in the past. The thing with climate change in the Great Lakes is it makes all of the problems we're already experiencing worse. And unfortunately, we're going to be facing decades of worsening problems as a result of a changing climate that we are going to have to adapt to. One of the best things we can do is to try to put a stop to those problems that we know we're already facing that are getting worse, so they don't become even more amplified under climate change. So for example, we already have a problem with harmful algae blooms in the Great Lakes that turn our drinking water toxic. Climate change makes water warmer. It makes the growing conditions for those toxic algae better. So the sooner we reduce the pollution that's causing those algae blooms, the sooner we're actually adapting to the climate change impacts on the Great Lakes. Likewise, you've got extreme storms that are causing flooding in people's homes and businesses and are adding to the problem of Great Lakes erosion at the shoreline. These extreme storms are another consequence of climate change. The sooner we start investing more money and more time in building resilient water infrastructure in our Great Lakes cities and along the coasts, the better job we're going to be doing at adapting to a changing climate. So we've got to be serious about reducing pollution. We've got to be serious about investing for resilient communities. And the more of that we do, the more climate ready the Great Lakes region is going to be.
Thanks, Joel. Keep those questions coming. We've got some great questions. I'm also going to put up our final slide here, which I think has our website address for the voter toolkit. As a reminder, I have a few questions here. We will be sending out an email later today with a recording of this webinar and links to all of the resources that we have mentioned today. So here's a good question, which I don't know the answer to, and it's, are there specific Great Lakes policies on the ballot this year that we should focus on? If yes, what are they? Obviously, that would be more of a state-specific issue, and I don't know if there are any like key referendums or ballot initiatives on any of the Great Lakes states ballots this year. So I'll toss that out to all three of you in case you have any thoughts or have know of any for people to be aware of this year. Or not.
Well,
and there may not be. That's,
there is. Give me 1 second.
Well, we can come back to that. I will note though that. Oh yeah, go ahead. I will note, though, that, again, going back to some of the points that Joel made in the beginning about how every elected office on the ballot has an opportunity to influence Great Lakes issues. And Joel, I don't know if you could give a couple more examples of that, maybe on infrastructure funding or some of the climate, some of those top issues that we've spoken about a little bit in this conversation today.
Molly, go ahead.
All right. Sorry for the delay. I was like trying to look up what the number was, and it's just silly because it's proposal 1. But certainly if you live in Michigan proposal 1, which has to do with state and local park funds, can have, an influence on water quality. And so I would encourage you, if you live in the state of Michigan, to take a look at that. And as a 501c3, we actually are able to endorse things like ballot measures, and the Alliance for the Great Lakes has endorsed Michigan Proposal 1. And so if you live in Michigan and you're on this webinar and you don't already know about that or don't have a position on it, please take a look at it. Back to you, Joel.
Sure, and Jen, that's a great example. And Jen asked for a couple more examples about how elected officials get involved in Great Lakes protection and clean water protection. And so, for an example, it's certainly not always like a clear 1 kind of relationship, but there's lots of examples of how local decisions have a big impact on the Great Lakes. I'll give you, there's one example of how I can give from some of our work where we're involved in an effort in Chicago to rethink how the city approaches land use planning in riverfront areas that are connected to Lake Michigan. And that's an area where local decisions will have a big impact on how people use open space and whether pollution is controlled in particular areas. That's not an election issue this year, but it's a way to think about local choices that end up having an effect on people's lives and how they connect or don't connect to clean water in their neighborhoods. Bigger picture, looking at the whole Great Lakes, I guess the classic example that I'll emphasize that has a whole lot of bipartisan support across the region has been for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is an effort to fund the cleanup of toxic chemicals and do a lot of other activities like building green infrastructure in cities that's been active with bipartisan support for a very long time. And so looking at the next generation of that program and increases to those funds as a place where there's been a lot of attention over recent years in looking at what that program could do for the Great Lakes. There's lots of examples out there in places where these kinds of decisions that are being made each year can have an effect on the Great Lakes. And so I just encourage you to, take the guide, look at some of the examples that we bring up in there and continue to learn more about these places where elected officials can themselves or candidates for elected office can learn more about the issues that you care about.
I'll also note, Jen, that it's important to acknowledge the reverse as well, that there are a number of Great Lakes issues that impact other industries as well. And it's important to make that note to both candidates and current office holders as well. The Great Lakes affect tourism, public health, education, economic development, and more. And so being able to make the case for why the Great Lakes should be a priority on everyone's agenda is important as well.
An excellent point, Crystal. And that leads right into our next question, which is an interesting one. I always learn something new from the questions on these. And the question is from Ken, and he says, in Summit County, Ohio, we elect our county engineer. I had no idea that could be an elected role. Is this an effective office to target for Great Lakes questions and push for Great Lakes policy development? Maybe some of you might know more than I do about what a county engineer does, I can imagine, and whether or not that might be somebody to ask some questions of. Does any of you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I hail from Summit County myself, an Akronite myself, and so I'm biased in this, but my answer is every office is an office that you should talk to about Great Lakes issues and water issues as a whole. They have a relationship with the other elected officials and the Summit County Council who now has a sustainability and environmental task force that's working on a number of different issues. And so I say any place where you can get an office, you can get the attention of an office holder. It's important to reiterate your support for these issues. Elected officials are everyday people, and they like to hear from their constituents, but they also like to hear from their friends. And so if you have a relationship with those folks, you should definitely reach out and communicate your support.
And I would just add that, you know, roads and transportation infrastructure are one of the biggest sources of stormwater runoff. And when runoff comes off of roads, it takes pollution with it. And county engineers in Ohio, and I think in other places, have a really important role and say in how roads are developed and, you know, where funding goes. And so there are ways that you can develop roads and transportation infrastructure that do a better job of capturing and treating that stormwater than others. And so the county engineer actually has a really important say in preventing pollution from coming off of roads into lakes and rivers.
Thanks, Molly. I just learned a whole lot. I have some questions here about, so I'll kind of smush these together, about early voting and whether or not that is really important and what people might be able to expect. We don't run the voting systems in all the Great Lakes states, but some questions around fewer voting sites, potentially longer lines. So I don't know if our panelists here would like to chime in on the role of early voting, which is certainly a hot topic this year, more than I think we've ever seen it before.
I think the most important thing is that you have a plan to vote. And you can use the Great Lakes Information Center, Voting Information Center, to make that plan. Certainly early voting is something that gives people who have access to that additional opportunities to vote. So, you know, there are places where you can vote by mail, places where you can go to specific polling locations to vote early. And then obviously everywhere where if you're registered to vote, you can show up and vote on election day. I think, you know, making it easy to vote is important. I think everyone on this call, I would encourage to make a plan to vote, and you can find out more about your options, whether that's mail-in ballots, early voting, voting on election day, when, where, and how to do that by visiting our Voter Information Center.
And make those soon, because even your plan may not go as planned. I learned that the hard way. I actually submitted my absentee ballot request and it was returned because I didn't have my birthday on it. And so now I still have enough time to request an absentee ballot again and then do the absentee ballot process. But if I had not done that earlier, I would have to change my plan and vote differently. So I'd say, you know, get a plan early. Things are a lot more hectic now that we're at home and there are so many safety precautions we have to take. And so I'd say definitely support Molly's theory of making a plan that fits in your family and works for you.
That's an excellent reminder, Crystal. Thank you. And certainly our Voter Information Center, which you can find at the link on your screen there, can help you do that. I also want to I'm reminded, I should have mentioned this earlier in some of the prior questions, and Molly referenced this briefly in the voter toolkit document. In that deep dive section, there are actually sample questions that you can ask about some of these specific issues, whether it is infrastructure, invasive species. I see some questions here about Asian carp popping up. We'll get to those in a minute. And drinking water affordability, etc. Algal blooms, pollution from agriculture. So definitely be sure to check out the toolkit because it has some specific examples of questions you can ask. And certainly, you know, as Crystal shared really helpfully, you know, modify those to whether it's to your county engineer or to whoever else that you're interested in talking to. It's a really helpful resource and easy to use. We've got a couple questions about Asian carp. Certainly a big concern is certainly keeping them out. And so the question is, how do we make sure our federally elected officials provide funding for the Brandon Road lock and dam as a preventative measure? I don't know, Molly or Joel, would you like to give a brief update on that issue and kind of where things stand?
Oh, sure. Asian carp's an issue that we've been working on for a long time, and I know a number of you on this webinar have probably been supporting us in working on for a long time, so thank you for that. Definitely having the federal funds available to move forward with that project is really important. And so I think as you're talking to candidates, you can ask them about their support of the Brandon Road project. You can ask them specifically about whether they support funding for the project. I think if you're talking to current office holders and you just want to talk to them about the issue, calling their offices and asking for an update, you know, neither, well, I don't want to, it looks unlikely that there will be appropriations completed this calendar year. And so that means there's a good opportunity to talk to elected officials at the federal level about the need to include funding for the Brandon Road project. And that's something, you know, that a number of elected officials in the Great Lakes region care really deeply about and have been working really hard on in a bipartisan way. And so I think calling those offices and reminding them that, hey, you're watching this issue, you care about this issue, and what is that elected official's plan to make sure that the Brandon Road project moves forward is a great way both to find out what, you know, how they're engaged in the issue, and also to remind them that you're watching and you care about this issue. Joel, anything to add?
There's a great comment here that notes that, you know, it's great if you're able to reach out directly to your elected officials, but there are lots of other ways to get involved in the election season. You know, partnering with groups who are doing phone banking or letter writing. There are some groups that have, you know, election day or election month these days, get out the vote efforts, you know, calling and reminding voters to go vote. And I do just want to share also that in our toolkit, Molly went through, you know, sort of the top 5 ways to get involved. And in the toolkit document, we have a lot of specific tips. So we have tips and suggestions on how you might find a virtual candidate forum on, you know, Facebook or YouTube or something that you can participate in. We have tips for how to use social media and different ways that you can get involved that way. So definitely be sure to check out the toolkit for some specific thoughts on how to get involved. But I'll ask our panelists, do you have any other thoughts on, you know, ways that people can get involved, even if they aren't, you know, calling their candidates or calling their local office holders directly, you know, maybe how to find those virtual candidate forums or submit questions to candidates. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts you want to add on that.
I would just, one thing we haven't talked about is, you know, don't underestimate the value of a comment about clean water in the Great Lakes to your local media. So, you know, making your opinion known to the opinion pages, writing a letter to the editor of a local news outlet, and even and especially smaller outlets that really do get the attention of both elected officials and candidates for office. Those are great places to get that perspective out there. So take a moment, share your opinion, and I guarantee you that candidates are paying attention to those opinion pages.
I'd also
For sure.
folks to talk to folks within your network. I can't overstate how important that is. I serve as the person in my family that goes around and encourages folks to vote, and then takes the time to break down these complex issues so folks understand what's at stake, and can make informed decisions about how to vote. Please be that person. Talk to your neighbors, make sure they have a voting plan. And you might be surprised about who they're connected to. They may be connected to elected officials. So just kind of get the word out, get the vote out is really important.
Absolutely. I have a couple questions here about line 5. Joel, I guess maybe I'll send those to you. Just some questions saying about, like, what's the status of this issue? Certainly, it's been a big controversy over the years, and asking about the Alliance's position on line 5.
Sure, Jen. We vote. We have supported decommissioning of Line 5 and revocation of the easement. That's a lot of policy words right there. What that basically means is, the current Line 5 is not sustainable and represents a threat to the Great Lakes, and it needs to go. And so there are some options available to the Michigan governor for how to make that happen that I know that she is currently considering how to move forward on, and that is the next step in that process. And so, but that's our position, and I know that that's really rests on Governor Whitmer taking the next step and making a choice about how to proceed with getting Line 5, the current Line 5, out of the Great Lakes. I will, also say, I just want to encourage you to check out, there are a lot of great organizations in Michigan that are working intensely on this issue. I'll just mention the Oil and Water Don't Mix Coalition as a place to start for learning more about that, which is a coalition of many Michigan-based organizations advancing work on Line 5. And there's lots of others too, but that's where things stand in the short version.
Thanks, Joel. Crystal, this next question is for you. It's about Ohio, and the question is, how well is Ohio doing in providing funding to ensure departments responsible for protecting Lake Erie are appropriately staffed, and as a result be effective in achieving their goals? And I know there's been a lot of activity over the past year with the H2 Ohio funding program, so maybe you could give us a brief update on that.
Sure. I've been very vocal about the fact that we applaud the action that Governor DeWine has taken on Lake Erie and his interest in water issues from day zero. Starting on the campaign trail, he talked about Lake Erie and held to promises to make an investment there. It's a longer discussion about what our vision is for Lake Erie and how we'd like to go from some of the voluntary measures that are being funded right now to some stringent policies that help us to achieve the phosphorus reduction goals. But I think so far we've seen an interest from both the governor's administration and the legislature in investing in Lake Erie and the EPA to make sure that our lake is protected. And so I applaud the efforts there.
Thanks, Crystal. I have another question here, which I guess, Joel, I will toss this one to you, but it's asking about, so the actual question is, are there federal and state legislative committees that address Great Lakes issues? And so I know there are some, like in Congress, there's a bipartisan Great Lakes task force. I would assume some state legislators have that, but it also makes me think about the role that legislators have in appointing people to places like the International Joint Commission or some of those other important committees that work across the region. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, like, are there any groups like the Great Lakes Legislative Task Force or that role that elected officials, particularly executives, play in appointing people to the various important Great Lakes groups?
Yeah, certainly. And so there are, legislators tend to organize themselves around issues that they care about and that and that people in their districts tell them that they care about. And so in Congress, there is a Great Lakes Congressional Task Force, which is a kind of ad hoc group of legislators that convenes across the Senate and the House to talk about and promote and advance work on Great Lakes issues. As Jen mentioned, similarly, there is a Great Lakes Legislative Caucus here in the Midwest, made up of state legislators who works across state lines to share information, develop legislative initiatives. And those task forces, caucuses, those can really be think tanks and generators of new ideas of how to approach Great Lakes policy that are led by the people who actually have the power to pass legislation. And so they can be really important places for building and showing the influence of the Great Lakes on public policy. And then to the point about appointments, that's a great point. I mentioned in my earlier comments about how executives like governors, the president, have the ability to appoint staff members who then make decisions, really important decisions about agencies like the US EPA or the state environmental regulator. There are also processes where, for example, the Senate has to confirm appointments for certain positions like the commissioners of the International Joint Commission. This is a binational US-Canada body that's actually charged with the management of Great Lakes water levels. And so those candidates or those commissioners have to be vetted and approved by the US Senate, as do some presidential appointees. And so senators have an opportunity there to work through their committees to actually ask questions of potential appointees during the approval process. There are many other committees in state legislatures and in the House and in the Senate that have key authorities over Great Lakes topics. It's a great question. A lot of the important decisions about what policies go forward actually do get made at that committee level. I wish we had another hour to talk through what some of those opportunities might be in the coming 2 years, but a great topic for a future webinar.
Thanks, Joel. Well, we are reaching the top of the hour. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but we tried to get to as many as possible in a wide variety of topics. So thank you to everybody for joining us and for sending lots of great questions. There's a lot of ways that you can get involved in the next 30-something days until the election on November 3rd. Certainly get out and vote, make your voting plan today. And as I said, we'll be sending you an email shortly with a link to the recording of this presentation, links to the toolkit, and links to the Voter Information Center. So thank you so much to our panelists, Joel, Molly, and Crystal, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thanks so much and have a good day.